Hello there, I'm Stevie Pearson, author of the Wrestling Noir saga. I've been a lifelong wrestling fan for as long as I can remember, and one of the things that appeals to me about wrestling is the characters involved, and the people behind those characters. In some broad terms, people might look at Hulk Hogan, The Rock, Steve Austin, and John Cena as guys who made it to the big time. But there's a whole slew of guys who might not have made it to such a high level in the business, but whose contributions in the business should not be overlooked. Louie Spicolli is one of them. Louie Spicolli, real name Louis Mucciolo, took his ring name from the character of the always stoned surfer played by Sean Penn in the cult movie classic Fast Times at Ridgemont High. He had been a big wrestling fan from the age of 14. He was enamored with the World Wrestling Federation during its glory days of drawing big houses monthly at the Los Angeles Sports Arena, which he attended religiously from getting interested in wrestling in 1985 during the early days of Hulk Hogan's title reign. There is actually a tape of a teenage Louis Mucciolo at ringside in the crowd of a Saturday Night's Main Event show taped at the Sports Arena in November of 1986. While attending a show at the Sports Arena, he met up with ring announcer Bill Leslar and began training with him at a garage in East Los Angeles with the Mexican luchadors when he was just 16 years old. Mucciolo was a good natural athlete, a standout high school pitcher with a great arm, who was actually believed to have had great potential, perhaps even pro potential in that sport. But he never cared for baseball, or school, or anything but wrestling, and dropped out of high school to follow his dream. His natural athletic ability made him pick up things rather quickly, and after just 3 months of training, just a few days after his 17th birthday, Billy Lester brought him in as a jobber to WF television tapings in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he had his first match putting over Ron Bass. Over the next several years, he worked as a WF jobber, highly regarded enough that he was used to not only local tapings, but flown to wherever the tapings were being held, and he was generally considered one of the best jobbers the company had. He continued that for several years on and off until he basically quit because he knew if he continued any longer he'd be typecast as a jobber, and he may have actually stayed a little too long in that role. But even in later years he would be brought in as opponents for certain guys, such as the Lightning Kid and Latin Fury, in dark matches at WWF tapings. He also teamed with Billy Lester and various third members of a trio of Los Mercenarios Americanos, a main event foreign heel trio working regularly at the Auditorium Municipal in Tijuana, holding a version of the World Trios Championships where he learned to work against Mexican wrestlers. He had used the name Spicolli for so long since starting in wrestling that virtually all of his friends and everyone in the wrestling industry knew him by that name. His friends looked up to him as he was the one in the group who had made it and was starting to live his dream. But they also feared for him because his drug use was hardly a well-kept secret. In early 1996, while working for the World Wrestling Federation as Rad Radford, after taking about 55 somas, he was found face down in a puddle in the rain in front of a neighbour's house and was rushed to the hospital. He was in a life-threatening condition for 2 days. At one point, he was actually clinically dead for a few minutes. While he tried to keep the cause of his collapse secret from the World Wrestling Federation, the company must have figured it out, as he was heavy into his somas. The WF wanted to get rid of him immediately, eventually after a lot of public haggling back and forth, giving him a full release after initially giving him a restricted release that wouldn't have allowed him to wrestle for World Championship Wrestling for the duration of his WF contract. He had gotten the WF job after the WF hierarchy had seen him on the AAA pay-per-view When Worlds Collide in November 1994, led to a contract offer literally days after the pay-per-view. After the World Wrestling Federation, he wound up in Extreme Championship Wrestling, largely as a favour called in by Sabu in 1993. While both were on tour with FMW, with Spicolli working under the mask as the White African, apparently Spicolli needed to go to the bathroom while on a lengthy bus ride. The bus driver wouldn't stop, and Sabu apparently told him to piss in a water bottle, which he did, and then threw it out the window. When Atsushi Onita found out about it, he fired Spicolli and Sabu, since he felt responsible by telling him to do so, felt somewhat beholden to him. At first, Spicolli received something of an undercard push, getting a big Pavlovian pop by coming out to the famous song Louie Louie, and being the master of the Death Valley Driver, a move he had seen watching All Japan Women tapes of Etsuko Mita that he pretty well brought to the United States. But the push stalled over a number of public and private issues. Spicolli's drug use, which he kept secret except from the boys and a few friends in the WWF, was becoming more flagrant and even scary. He took as many as 85 somas in one sitting at his worst. It was not unusual for both in the WF and ECW for him to pass out on airplanes and be taken to emergency rooms to throw it up out of his system, and miss connected flights and show up late for shows. It became bad enough that Paul Heyman considered it a company embarrassment and feared for potential repercussions. At the same time, Sabu would always back up Spicolli and keep Heyman from getting rid of him. What happened at this point depends on whose version of events you wish to believe. Spicolli was unhappy about his lack of a push and money, and felt that Heyman was making up stories to make him look bad to Sabu, and thus be able to justify getting rid of him. Heyman said at the time he was mad because Spicolli's ring work wasn't improving, and he wasn't attending afternoon training sessions before the show, although privately was scared of a potential problem on his watch. At the same time, with relationships worsening between the two, Heyman found out that Spicolli had called Bruce Pritchard of the WF and was trying to break a deal where he, Sabu, and Rob Van Dam would all leave for the WWF. Heyman also claimed to have found out from Kevin Sullivan that Spicolli was later trying to get into WCW as well. Spicolli readily admitted the former but denied the latter. Spicolli, missing another shot in the midst of all this because he passed out on an airplane, didn't help his cause. Finally, according to Spicolli, he was fed up because he was buried and his feud with Tommy Dreamer was cut off and he wasn't being booked on the company's Hardcore Heaven pay-per-view. He quit after getting word that Terry Taylor was getting him a job with WCW. Heyman claimed he had fired him. Although Spicolli did quit, there is no question it was a quitting desired and manipulated by Paul Heyman because of a fear of what the future might bring. Although Spicolli had claimed at the time he was furious at Heyman for telling people he had fired him when he actually quit, according to Heyman, he fired Spicolli because of his problems and because Heyman's own fears of having the next wrestling tragedy be in his locker room. Spicolli remained tight friends with Sabu after leaving ECW, and the two talked regularly on the phone. And Sabu was said to have cried nearly the entire flight back from Germany on Sunday night after getting the bad news. He started working at World Championship Wrestling at the Orlando television tapings in August, and that job nearly ended right after it started as well. Just a few weeks later, he overdosed on somas again and was hospitalised. They were able to get him to throw up and he was released later that day. It was a near miss about WCW finding out about it, as when he was in hospital, Terry Taylor called and was simply told he wasn't home. If Taylor had called a few hours earlier, he would have caught Spicolli in a bad enough shape to realise something was up. Spicolli finally took that as a wake-up call and kicked the pills cold turkey for about a week, until finding out his mother had lymphatic cancer and was only expected to live a few more months. That put Spicolli in an emotional tailspin, and he started back up. His peer group in WCW made the situation worse, as he was stunned to find out just how pervasive use was within the company. He was mainly used as a television wrestler in WCW, in somewhat of a glorified jobber role, like one of the 30 other wrestlers in the company's brought in about the same time, until getting tight with Scott Hall in particular, and coming up with the idea of being an NWO pledge and something of a Scott Hall gopher, a role that somewhat mirrored what real life had become of him on the road. It was basically a comedy gimmick that he suggested to Hall, and Hall went to bat for him on it, where he was used to put over Larry Zbyszko to keep Hall and Larry's issue going while delaying a second match between the two. 5 days before his death, in doing a colour routine with Tony Schiavone and Mike Tenay on Nitro, his performance shocked everyone, and all of a sudden he became in the mix, with talks about making him a regular, perhaps as a comedic heel colour commentator, and make him somewhat of a mid-level name within the company. He was brought back on Thunder 3 days later in the same role, where he nearly shot himself in the foot by responding to a line by Tony Schiavone about there being a bombshell later in the show, by saying he shouldn't use the word bombshell in Oklahoma City. Schiavone, who apparently early in the day had been sightseeing and had seen displays of horrific sights of kids dying torturous deaths regarding the famed Oklahoma City bombing, was already broken up with that remark and made things worse. Spicolli immediately knew he had screwed up. But other than being told that this wasn't ECW, and that wasn't the kind of line you could get away with, wasn't given any indication there would be any serious problems stemming from the line, and it would be chalked up to bad judgment. Aside from that, he was in really good spirits regarding his career coming off his performance on Nitro, and had brought his mother and his grandmother to the Thunder tapings to introduce him to his celebrity co-workers. Louis Spicolli's career might not have been the shining or glittering example that many of his peers had during this era, but he was a very good performer, and he truly had a love of this business that no one else could rival. Louis Spicolli died at the age of 27, on what some felt was the verge of his biggest break in the business. Sadly, we'll never know whether that's true or not, but what we do know, and what we can all say, was that Louis Spicolli was a damn fine professional wrestler, and he remains one of professional wrestling's what could have been. I, for one, was proud to follow Louis Spicolli's career, and I hope in retrospect you can share the same pride as I can.